My prayer is in the next few minutes that something is said or something that rings a bell or the Holy Spirit's able to take something and make actual change in your life. And the reason why I know that it's possible that He's done so in my life. Rarely does a message resonate so much in my own heart. And I just expect great things today. And I told someone this morning, I said, if only one. And he goes, well, you already have one. It's you. And I said, well, if there's one more, we could double it. That would be great. But I'm going to pray that God uses it somehow in your life. By the way, let me ask a question. How many of you are men and live within 10 minutes and you're so old you get up before it's light? Let me see your hands. Okay, so you're going to kind of regret putting your hand up because we're trying this last home stretch of this last 3 or 4 months in this building where we have to set up church and then tear down church. We could really use a couple, 2 or 3 more men and women. If you don't mind, we do have one woman that doesn't mind getting dusty and dirty. And although it's really not a dusty, dirty, sweaty job, it just takes some time. And so we from 7:30 to 8:15 come in, we blow in here really fast, set up church, and then we all head home and grab showers and breakfast and come back. So if you're one of those guys that lifted your hands, this is not a life commitment. I promise. The lease has been signed on the building. There'll be none of that come this summer. But if you're one of those, I don't have one, would you take that card? Would someone raise up that communication card? Let's see what that looks like. Someone up here, have it? You got that in your hand? Okay. Take that communication card and write down 7:30 a.m., your name and your number, and someone will reach out to you this week. Hey, the book of Nehemiah takes place about 400 or some odd years before Jesus. And it was during the period known as the Babylonian exile, and it was right at the end of the exile. And what happened was a guy named Nehemiah, who held a secular job, because he's got an entire book in the Bible named after him, it would be a easy mistake to think that he was a prophet or a priest or some holy or extra spiritual person with a title, and that's not the case. His title was cupbearer, which means when he went to work and he came home, it was a good day. If he goes to work and doesn't come home, it means he did his job, it just wasn't the best day. He was a cupbearer. He drank the best of wines and the best of foods. So he had $200 bottles of wine, and he had the best fish that you could possibly, and the freshest fish you could eat, and his job was to eat before the king and make sure it wasn't poisonous. And as a cupbearer, he didn't have special training, meaning he wasn't a guy that was placed in his job after training to be a spiritual person or a leader. Neither. He was just an ordinary Joe. And what he had seen about 100 years earlier, of course not in his lifetime, but on his parents and his parents' parents, is he saw that the temple was rebuilt. If you've been to Jerusalem, as many of you have, you know that on the Temple Mount, it's all level, but there is a Muslim mosque that sits on top of that Temple Mount. The Jews today can still pray for, and as Christians, we believe that someday there will be a temple again on that mount. It's just a matter of time. We don't know how, we don't know where. We don't know when, we do know where. In fact, it's interesting, those of you who've been to the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall is what it's really called, you know that as you're sitting there, you could have a rabbi, and you could have a Muslim, and you can have a Christian, all praying against each other at that moment, that hellfire would come down and kill these people, and this would go away, and all of that happening right at one single spiritual wall. What's different about being in Israel is the two topics that we don't talk about here over coffee or lunch are what? Politics and religion. The two topics that they love to talk about and can't get enough of in Israel is what? Politics and religion. They love talking politics. Last time I was there, it was right before 16, before the big that summer before the presidential election, and everyone wanted to talk about Trump. Everybody wanted to talk about the election. Everybody had things to say and talk about. And before you know it, I'm sitting in this circle with bus drivers and taxi drivers, and the smoke was thick and blue, and there was beer and coffee everywhere, and all they wanted to know is this American's opinion. It was great. It was hilarious. It's the two topics that they don't want to talk about anything else except those two. And so here is Nehemiah that saw the temple built, but there was a problem. The wall around it wasn't. I've never heard of someone trying to build a wall and making a big deal of it. But I'm guessing that maybe they were hats, making Jerusalem great again, maybe, or something. I don't know. And so here we go, Nehemiah saying we need to protect the temple. We got the temple built, but we have no way to protect the temple. It's sitting vulnerable. And as he looked around and watched, there was no one else getting involved. There was no one else that seemed to even care. They noticed, they all knew it, but no one was doing anything about it. And so last week we learned three things. One is, it's never a waste of time to pray audacious prayers. That's the first thing that we learned last week, is that Nehemiah started praying, and it was a very personal prayer. No one knew what he was praying. And the prayer was, God, the wall, the temple itself is vulnerable. His prayer was so great and so big and so crazy that no one could possibly think about praying that prayer. And so his first thing that we learned is it's never a waste of time to pray the audacious. Two is we learned that not everyone will love what you're doing. We learned that there were a couple men who saw and heard what was happening, and they were against it immediately. As soon as they got word, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more this morning, they knew that was something that they hated, and they were going to do everything they can to discourage it. Number three, we learned that sometimes it's best to wait until you go public with your mission. Meaning this, sometimes it's a better idea to just wait and let that come into you, let God talk to you, and then wait for the right moment to make it a public declaration. So many times in our life, we declare something, and we declare too soon, and before you know it, you've got naysayers and negative people, and they've got problems with it, and well, what about this, and what about that? And what Nehemiah did is he walked around that city at nighttime for 3 days, evaluating, looking, and assessing the problem in the project before anyone could be negative and discouraged. And number four, we learned that maybe God's calling you, and you alone, to get something done. And afterwards in the lobby, I talked to more than one person, actually I think it was just two, that said, God's dealing something in my life, and that message was for me. So today's message is this: when people collide. I have found that conflict is inevitable. Sometimes we spend too much time trying to escape conflict, but in reality, sometimes it's tension and conflict that's necessary to make us better. Some things we already know. We know what doesn't work. I have a list of things. These have been tactics that I've used in my life. Instead of addressing the conflict at hand, these are things that I've chosen to do instead. Temper, sarcasm, bullying, intimidation, passive-aggressive, backbiting, avoidance, silent treatment, and revenge. There is no message that you will hear from this platform that is more applicable to all of us than this one. The process of how we handle conflict, the procedure that we choose to use when we and our opinions and our thoughts and our expectations collide, determines by itself whether God can use you to do his mission or he shelves you. These are the responses to conflict that are so common with folks. And each of us, when maturity and the Holy Spirit together come into our lives, we can derail from those and go a different direction. Quick story, I've told it once, but you forgot it. So let me just tell it again. One day, Judy and I were having a disagreement, and it got to the point where we got up the next morning and it wouldn't go away, and it got bigger and bigger. And so I went to work, and I went to the office, and I sat down with one of the other pastors, and I thought that maybe it'd be a good idea to maybe share. And I go, here's the deal. We've kind of hit a pass, and as we started talking, I realized that it was my response to her and her expectation of responding in the way that I thought she should respond, that the response of her was actually appropriate to the things that I was saying and doing. And I found myself guilty. So the drive home was typically 22 minutes, and it felt like 22 hours. And I'm driving, and I go in, and she says something, and my response at that moment, at that second, before we could get in to have a conversation after the dinner and put the kids up to bed and come down and talk, her response was, so I said something about, you're right, I'm wrong. And she turned and looked at me, and she says, you don't have to be snarky about it. And I realized that we had gone to the point where she no longer could trust, not necessarily the things I was saying, but how I was saying them. And when you look at passive aggressiveness, or you look at backbiting, or you look at cold shoulders, you look at all of those things scream one thing: I don't want to work it out, but I want to make you pay. We had a conversation that night, and I said, I want you to know that actually that was not, I promise you, that was not something that was coming out of me snarky. It would have yesterday, but today I really meant it. And the whole tone, and the whole conversation, and the whole relationship softened. Which takes us to Nehemiah chapter 4. Last week I encouraged you to pick up the YouVersion Bible app. How many did that? Okay, several of you did. I would recommend getting that. The notes from the sermon is in that app. And I'm going to start reading chapter 4, Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1. Listen to this. Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered. He was snarky. He was cutting. He was trying to pick a fight with the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and the army of Samaria, what are these feeble Jews even doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? How long is this going to take? Will they revive the stones of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that? Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, yes. What are they building? Oh, and here's the cut down of the century. Here it is. Listen to what he said. He goes, if a fox goes on it, he'll break down the wall. What? I'm sure Nehemiah was reading that going, that's the best you got? If a fox goes up, it'll crumble. Dude, you're not even funny. Verse 6. So we built the wall. And all the wall was joined together to half its height, meaning the job was, we were clipping along. It's half done. For the people had a mind to get it done. Number one, it all starts with name calling. It all starts with verbal attacks. It all starts with the tongue. And the things that come out of my mouth and the words that I choose to use about someone else, words that are designed to put them down, are designed to lift me up. Because the more I talk about you and how low you are, the higher I find myself going in the eyes of my own mind. It all starts with words. And it all starts with name calling. Have you ever met somebody, better yet, you ever know somebody and you try to describe them to somebody, and as you think about who they are, you say these words. You know what? I've never heard them say a negative thing about anybody. And then the other person goes, you know what? You're right. I've never heard it either. Why is it that for the person who never has a bad thing to say about anyone is the exception and not the rule? And as these two goofballs were sitting back, crossed their arms, as these two guys were just sitting there thinking to themselves, oh, they're never going to get it done. They're never going to finish the project. They're never going to do what they say they're going to do. In fact, the whole project probably is ridiculous. It's been fine for 100 years. Why are they having to build the wall to begin with? And we find that it all starts with a name calling. Let me add this. Sometimes our name calling is so subtle. Sometimes the way we speak of someone is so slighted, backdoor, that we as those that want to be careful, according to James, to tame our tongue and not be divisive, I have gotten so good that I can actually say things about someone, but I can actually say it in a spiritual way that there's no one that could possibly accuse me of saying those negative words about another person. A couple years ago, I think it was a sermon I was listening to online. It's probably my own. I love listening to me. And this person, he or she, I don't know what it was at the time, but they said, be careful of the words you say about someone else, because they themselves are image bearers to God. And that resonated with me. That how dare I speak negatively about someone who bears the image of the Almighty and created in His image with value by love. So the first thing I notice is two guys that just start the process. One, by the way, that's not stopping anytime soon. You're going to see this thing develop and get pretty nasty. But it all started with words. Look at verse 7. It says, but when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the preparing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they got angry. When they started seeing the progress, not only was the wall half built, but they started to see them all coming together, and all of the breaches around the temple and around the city were closing. They realized that their words were no longer enough. They realized that their resistance was, at least at this time and at this point, futile. So they had to up their game. And in upping their game, they said, you know what? We've been talking. Now it's time to take this to another level, and their blood pressure and their heart rate was starting to go up, and they were angry. Do you realize, let me stop there. Do you realize in the context of the story, so let me take you back up to 35,000 feet. Do you realize that what they're angry about is that the wall was protecting the temple, a wall that had been there for hundreds of years, and it was in ruins. It was collapsed. It was to protect families within the city, and it was to protect their precious temple. Remember, the temple is where God lived. So this isn't just like a church. This isn't just a building that we would have today. This is the temple. And God resided there. And they were angry, furious, that somebody was coming along to protect it. My point is this, that those who speak the harshest often are the most unreasonable. In the process of reasoning with someone who is against you or the project or whatever God has called you to do, reasoning with that person is a ridiculous chore. You can't. It's throwing pearls before the swine. So number 2, we see unjustified anger. And anger comes out in all kinds of different ways. Yes, it comes out in words, but we're going to see that it starts coming out in other ways as well. In the process of watching someone speak and then start raising their game to a level of anger, it's unpredictable. In fact, start reading verse 8. Listen to what happens. It says, and then they all plotted together, verse 8, to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion within it, verse 8. Which leads me to point number 3. It's the recruitment of others. Negativity needs company. In the process by which we respond to those who start with verbal attacks, anger rises, and then the recruitment, the plotting of others, the recruitment of others for their mission, which is against yours, and really it's found in the text, verse 8, is to cause confusion. It is at this point where it is so tempting to just give up. Like, I'm trying to help you people. And you're just working against us. In fact, look in verse 14, drop down, it says, and I looked and rose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people. So Nehemiah says, I went to everyone. I went to those in the government. I went to the religious leaders. I went to the people. I went everywhere. And he said this, do not be afraid of them. Remember, here it is, that the Lord is great and awesome. And that's the message that I have for you right now. God is more than good. He's great and He's awesome. And then He says, and fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes. This isn't for you. You're representing and fighting and protecting an awful lot of people. Fight for them. This morning, as I got up, as I often do, and just grabbed my coffee and kind of think this thing through one last time, I made myself a graph. Can you see that from here? Can you read that? You got bad eyes. At the top, I wrote the difference between a leader who says that I am great versus a leader that says God is great. And I wrote 2 columns. And this is just as much for me as for you. And so if you don't get anything out of this, that's okay. I wrote those that say, the leaders that say I'm great. They say these things. These are the things that happen to that person. There's self-doubt, pressure, fear exposure, paranoia. I wrote paranoid because I couldn't spell paranoia. Manipulate others, worry about the future, care only for me, self-protection, and it's all about the task and it being mine. That's a leader, or that's a person, or that's a follower of Jesus who says, I am great. I am great says, I want you to know how great I am. And I will help you know and learn how great I am. And then I wrote a second column. For the person who says God is great, there's rest, there's care for others, there's love of people. In fact, it's all about people. Know that God will protect you. There's no fear for anyone because I fear only the living God. And there's confidence in me because my confidence comes through Him. And the result, the result. They were hoping, boy, were they hoping, that their words, their verbal attacks, they were hoping the anger that they were showing, and who knows how many ways it was coming out. Thirdly, they were hoping that plotting others and grabbing as many people as we could to go, get on with me here. Let's fight them, let's cause confusion. Their hope was, right here, verse, end of 20, our God will fight for us. Verse 21, so we labored at the work, and half of them held spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at the time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So in causing confusion, it did work. It made that these people couldn't go home and sleep and see their families at night, but they had to keep guard. So they kept guard at night and they worked during the day. And while working, somewhere in the text, it says here that as they were working, they actually, verse 23, so neither I nor my brother nor my servant nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. So no one slipped into the PJs at the end of a day. No one kicked their shoes off and sat back and relaxed. They kept their clothes on at day and night, and they slept and worked with a spear. They made it so hard that they literally made the project twice as hard and difficult as it needed to be. Twice. And Nehemiah said, that's not going to stop me. We're going to build a wall. Here's my question for you today. The wall that you're building in your life, the project that God has given you, whether it's in your home, it's in a personal relationship, or maybe even at work, or maybe even a ministry that you lead. My question, I had to boil it down to one. And if I had to, I would boil it and say this. I would ask the simple question. Who today are you trusting? Who are you trusting? And for some of you in this room, you've watched God perform miracles, and you're aware of his faithfulness because you've watched him do things that are unbelievable. You can't fathom it. In fact, out of curiosity, how many in this room, you've walked with God long enough, and it could be only a week, but you've walked with God long enough that you've seen him do the most audacious things and perform miracles in your life, and you can only attribute it to one person, and that is God. Let me see your hands. So many of you. Yeah, okay, so you get it. And there may be some, and by the way, did you notice, if you haven't, if you've never been there, you notice the amount of hands? Each story is different for everybody. Mine's different than yours. Yours is different than the person next to you. All I know is that God's calling us to one thing. Ignore those with the negativity. Sometimes it means protect yourself and be prepared, knowing that they could be up to anything. So you may have to sleep in your clothes for a while and sleep with a spear and eat with a spear and work with a spear. You imagine at the end of the project, they'd go, I cannot wait to get rid of this dumb spear. I'm tired of looking at it. I'm tired of playing with it. I'm tired of sharpening it. I'm tired of this dumb spear. And in 56 days, the wall was built. And that's God. I invite you, as a friend, to trust God with that which is in your life that is bigger than you. Because I promise, not only does he know he's at work, and you're going to have a story to tell that just says God written all over it. Let me just say one more thing with 1 minute left here. I got to tell you, how much easier is it for you to trust God knowing that since then, Jesus himself, God himself came as Jesus, lived, died, and rose on the third day to prove to you that he's got this. Nehemiah didn't have that. He was an ordinary Joe. But for some reason, God called him. But we have Jesus. Man, I'm glad I do. Aren't you glad you do? Let me pray for you, God.